Victor Harris stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, his sharp gaze lost in the vast expanse of the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered beneath him, alive with the hum of ambition, progress, and dreams. Yet, for all the splendor around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing in an empty, echoing room. At 45, he had everything he ever wanted: money, power, influence, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. The penthouse was filled with the finest things money could buy, yet it all felt cold, sterile, and somehow lifeless. The leather couches, the expensive art adorning the walls, the polished mahogany floors. It was all a mere backdrop to the emptiness he felt inside. Victor had built his empire from the ground up. He started as a young, driven entrepreneur, relentless in his pursuit of success. Over the years, he turned his vision into a billion-dollar company, investing in real estate and tech, making deals that brought him wealth beyond imagination. But the more his wealth grew, the more he found himself alone. His 2 failed marriages had left him jaded, and he couldn't bring himself to believe in love anymore. Relationships, to him, were just another transaction, something that could be bought and sold. He had long ago closed his heart off from the possibility of love, choosing instead to bury himself in his work. He had always known he wanted to leave behind a legacy, to have a child who would inherit not just his fortune, but his name. Someone who would carry on his bloodline, someone who would continue the empire he had built. But as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that finding the right woman to share his life with, or even to simply have a child, wasn't something that would happen through love or fate. He was running out of time, and the pressure was mounting. His only thought was to secure a future for his wealth, and he had to find a way to do it without the messiness of emotional ties. Victor had already been through 2 failed marriages, both of which ended in heartbreak and bitterness. In both relationships, the promises of love were shattered by betrayal, misunderstandings, and unmet expectations. Now, standing alone in his penthouse, he realized he could no longer afford to waste time on something as unreliable as love. No, if he was going to have a child, it would be on his terms, and it would be part of a contract. He would buy the opportunity to become a father, just as he had bought everything else in his life. He paced the room, his mind churning with possibilities. What if he could find a woman who would agree to have his child for a price? Someone who had no expectations of love or intimacy, someone who was simply looking for security and stability. In a world where everything had a price, why shouldn't parenthood be no different? His thoughts turned to the kind of woman he might find. She wouldn't be someone of his social circle, not someone who had the expectations of a typical relationship. No, he needed someone who was desperate, someone who would see the financial security he could offer as a lifeline. It didn't matter who she was, or what she looked like. As long as she could carry his child, the rest was irrelevant. Victor made a decision. He would find her. It didn't matter how. He would set the terms, draw up a contract, and ensure that this child would inherit his name. The idea of an heir, someone who would carry on his legacy, seemed like the only thing that could finally give him a sense of purpose. And the best part? It would be simple. No strings attached, no emotional entanglements. Just a straightforward agreement. She would carry his child, and in return, he would provide her with everything she could ever need. The world was full of people who wanted a way out of their circumstances, and he would offer them an escape. A mother, a child, and a man who could provide everything for them. A perfect transaction. It was the only solution to his loneliness and his growing sense of emptiness. But what Victor didn't realize, as he sat in his grand penthouse planning the logistics of his unconventional fatherhood, was that fate had other plans. And that plan would begin on a rainy afternoon, when he would encounter a woman unlike any he had ever imagined. A woman who would change everything. It was then that his life began to spiral in a direction he never anticipated. A path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, control, and the human heart. The pursuit of an heir, the search for a transactional relationship, would unravel in ways Victor could never have predicted. Victor Harris sat behind the wheel of his Lamborghini Diablo, the engine's powerful hum vibrating through the plush interior. It was late afternoon, and the streets of New York were alive with a frantic energy that only the city could muster. He navigated through the traffic effortlessly, his mind focused on the task ahead, finding a woman who could bear his child. His plan was already forming in his mind, a carefully constructed strategy that would unfold just as he intended. But for now, he had to make his way through the city, his mind consumed with numbers, deals, and contracts. As he approached a red light near Central Park, he glanced at his watch, irritated at the delay. The bustling noise of the city filled the car, but his thoughts were miles away, distracted by the details of his plan. But then, something caught his eye. A woman, standing on the corner of the street, her eyes locked on his car. She wore a tattered coat, her face pale and weathered from the cold, but it was her eyes that held his attention. They were an impossible shade of green, sharp, intense, almost unnerving in their gaze. She stepped forward, raising her hand to his window as if offering something, asking for something. The light changed, and the traffic behind him began to move. Victor's instincts kicked in, and he reached for the button to roll up his window. He wasn't interested in any of the city's countless street vendors or panhandlers. His thoughts were already on his next move, and he didn't have time to waste on this. But then, just as the window began to close, she said something that stopped him. "Please, can you spare some change? Anything would help." Her voice was soft, yet there was a hint of desperation in it. Something in her tone that felt almost out of place, too real for the usual pleas that came from the streets. Victor hesitated, his fingers pausing on the window button. He took another look at her. Her wild, disheveled hair, the ragged clothes that barely protected her from the cold. His hand hovered above the button for a second longer, then he pressed it again, letting the window roll down. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Victor could see the exhaustion in her face, the unspoken history of hardship in the lines around her eyes. Her lips trembled slightly, but she didn't speak again. The cold wind from outside swirled around her, tugging at her thin coat. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was her eyes, or maybe the weariness in her voice. But something made him stop. "I don't have any change," Victor said flatly, his tone detached. He was ready to drive off, to leave her behind, just another face in a city full of them. But then, to his surprise, the woman didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head, as if considering something. Her gaze softened, and she stepped closer to the window. "I don't need much," she said quietly, her voice a little more steady now. "Just a little help, so I can get out of here." Victor frowned, unsure of what to make of her words. "Get out of here?" he echoed, confused. "Yes," she said, her voice firming slightly. "I'm not from here. I'm just passing through. I don't belong in the streets, but I don't have anywhere else to go." Her words, though simple, stirred something in Victor. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just a raw honesty that was rare in a world that often hid its truths behind polished facades. It was then that Victor realized something. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was a request for something more. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for a chance, for an opportunity. And that, in some twisted way, intrigued him. Without thinking, he turned the car off and opened the door, stepping out. The woman looked startled as he approached her, but she didn't retreat. "Get in the car," he said, his voice more abrupt than he intended. She stared at him for a long moment, hesitation flashing in her eyes. What do you want?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "I don't have time for games. I have a proposition for you," Victor said, his tone cold. But beneath it was something darker. A sense of control, a sense of power that came from knowing he could make things happen. The woman took a step back, clearly wary. "A proposition?" she repeated slowly. "What kind of proposition?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at his car and then at her, sizing her up. He could see the vulnerability in her. She was scared, lost, and desperate. And in that moment, he knew exactly what he could offer her. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I want you to have my child," he said bluntly, the words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "I'll give you everything you need. A home, money, Anything you want. All you have to do is agree to be a surrogate." The woman's face went pale as she stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. "You what?" she stammered. "Are you serious?" Victor nodded, his expression hardening. "Yes, I'm serious. You'll be paid handsomely, and your life will change. You'll have everything you've ever dreamed of. Just do this for me, and you'll never have to worry again." The silence stretched between them. Sarah, because that was what she had finally introduced herself as, seemed to weigh his words carefully. Her eyes darted between his face and the car, and for a long moment, Victor wasn't sure what she was thinking. Then, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Why me?" Victor didn't answer right away, but then a thought struck him. Something simple, something he could offer without the pretense of empathy or affection. "Because you need help," he said simply. "And I need an heir." She studied him for a few more seconds, her face unreadable. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she nodded. "I'll do it." And just like that, a deal was struck. What started as a fleeting encounter had turned into something far more complicated, far more unpredictable. Neither of them knew it then, but their lives would never be the same again. Victor didn't look back as they drove off, but somewhere deep inside, he felt the first stirrings of doubt, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The drive back to Victor's mansion was silent, the tension hanging thick between him and Sarah. He kept his eyes on the road, his mind already shifting gears, thinking ahead to the next steps. He wasn't one to waste time on small talk, and frankly, he didn't care to know much about Sarah's life. She was a means to an end. But there was something about her, a quiet determination, a resilience hidden beneath the ragged exterior, that intrigued him more than he was willing to admit. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap. She had barely spoken since she agreed to the arrangement, and Victor wasn't sure whether it was fear or disbelief that had silenced her. In truth, it was more than a little shocking to be driven through the streets of Manhattan in a luxury car after a life of struggle. She had always lived day to day, scraping by, hoping for the chance to escape the streets, to find a way out of the suffocating despair she had known for years. But this offer, this proposition, felt like something out of a movie. It felt unreal, and for a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. But the harsh reality of the world she had lived in, and the sharp clarity in Victor's eyes, told her otherwise. This was real, and it was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to escape a life that had never truly belonged to her. When they arrived at Victor's mansion, a sprawling estate tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, Sarah felt her heart race. The sheer size of the house, the opulence of it, was overwhelming. She had seen the mansions in magazines, but standing before one in person felt different. The gate opened as they approached, and Victor led her through a long driveway that wound up to the front of the house. The lights from the grand entrance illuminated the stone facade, casting a soft glow over the immaculate grounds. Victor's world was a far cry from the street corners where Sarah had once begged for spare change. The contrast was almost dizzying. He led her inside without ceremony, guiding her through the grand marble foyer. The mansion was as cold and sterile on the inside as it appeared on the outside, with sharp lines and sleek, modern furnishings that gave the entire place an air of detachment. Everything was pristine, untouched, except for the part of her that already felt out of place. "You'll be staying in the guest suite for now," Victor said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He was already moving toward the staircase, seemingly in a hurry, as if the decision had already been made, and there was no room for hesitation. Sarah stood still for a moment, taking it all in. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. She had seen the wealth in Victor's eyes when he spoke about the contract, and she had seen the distance in his demeanor. This wasn't an offer of kindness. It was business. He wanted something from her, and she had agreed to give it. But even as the realization settled in, she couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope that began to form in her chest. Victor led her through the sprawling halls to a door at the end of a long corridor. He opened it, revealing a lavish guest suite. The room was large, with a king-sized bed adorned in rich linens and a view of the gardens outside. "You'll have everything you need here," he said, his voice impersonal. The lawyers will be in touch tomorrow to finalize the details of the contract. You'll be starting the IVF process soon after. Sarah nodded, unsure of what to say. She felt overwhelmed, the weight of the decision already pressing on her shoulders. It was too much to process all at once. But there was no turning back now. Victor paused for a moment, as if he was about to say something else, but then he simply turned and left, closing the door behind him. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah sank onto the bed, feeling the soft sheets beneath her, but the luxury of it all felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she should feel relief or fear. This was her chance to escape her old life, but it came at a price she wasn't sure she was ready to pay. As the hours passed, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She hadn't expected it to unfold like this. She hadn't expected the offer to come from a man like Victor Harris, a man whose wealth and power could buy anything he desired. She had expected something more complicated, more emotional, but instead, everything about this arrangement felt clinical, transactional. And yet, something about Victor intrigued her. There was a coldness to him, a sharp edge that suggested he wasn't the type to form connections. She had seen the way he had looked at her in the car, distant yet calculating. He wasn't interested in her as a person. She was just a vessel, a means to an end. And yet, she couldn't ignore the small, quiet voice in her mind that asked, "What if this is your chance? What if this could change everything?" The next morning, Sarah was introduced to Victor's lawyer, a sharp-looking man named Mr. Donovan, who wasted no time in getting down to business. They sat across from each other at a sleek conference table, the papers spread out in front of her. She didn't understand all the legal jargon, but she didn't need to. She understood the basic terms. She would carry Victor's child through IVF, and in return, she would be given financial stability, a home, and a future she had never dreamed of. The lawyer was businesslike, efficient. He didn't offer her sympathy or make her feel at ease. Everything was laid out in cold, hard terms, and Sarah signed the papers with a quiet sense of inevitability. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just the sharp scratch of the pen as it marked the beginning of something that would change her life forever. When the papers were signed, Mr. Donovan left them to their business, and Victor and Sarah were left alone in the room. Victor didn't smile, didn't offer any congratulatory words. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Now, we move forward," he said. And with that, Sarah realized there was no turning back. What had begun as a simple agreement was quickly becoming something far more complicated. Something she wasn't ready for, but something she was now bound to. The following days were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and medical appointments. The mansion, with its towering walls and endless rooms, felt less like a refuge and more like a gilded cage. Sarah had little time to reflect on the life she had left behind on the streets, as everything around her seemed to move at a breakneck pace. She was swallowed up by Victor's world, a world of sterile efficiency, cold transactions, and quiet distance. But the lavish lifestyle she now found herself in was not enough to silence the thoughts that swirled in her mind. Victor's lawyer, Mr. Donovan, had arranged everything. The fertility clinic, the doctors, the endless forms and contracts that needed to be signed. She had gone through a battery of tests already. Blood work, ultrasounds, screenings, everything was set for the IVF procedure. It all felt so mechanical. The process was treated as nothing more than a series of steps to be completed. She was a part of the equation, a necessary variable in the transaction Victor had orchestrated. Sarah found herself standing in the sterile, bright office of Dr. Helen Adams, the head fertility specialist at one of the most prestigious clinics in the city. The walls were lined with diplomas and certifications, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. Victor had insisted on the best, and she had to admit that the clinic's reputation made her feel a strange sense of security, even if she was still an unwilling player in the game that was unfolding around her. Dr. Adams greeted her with a warm smile, but Sarah could see the clinical detachment in her eyes. This was business to them, too. "We've gone over your medical history, Sarah," Dr. Adams said, flipping through the file in front of her. "Everything checks out. You're healthy, and we have no reason to believe there will be any complications during the IVF process." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She had heard these words before, from doctors who had spoken to her like a patient, but today they felt different. This wasn't about hope. It wasn't about trying for a family out of love. It was a transaction, cold and simple. I'll be administering the first round of hormone treatments next week, Dr. Adams continued. It's an intensive process, but we'll monitor you closely. The doctor's professionalism, though reassuring, made Sarah feel more like a test subject than a person. She hadn't asked for this. She had never imagined her life could turn in this direction. One where her body, her very existence, was bargained and traded for a life of comfort she had never known. But as the days wore on, Sarah began to feel the heavy weight of her decision pressing on her. At night, when the house was silent, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning herself. She had signed the contract, but was it the right choice? Was this her only option? Would this arrangement truly give her the freedom she craved, or was she simply trading one form of captivity for another? Victor's words echoed in her mind. You'll never have to worry again. But would she? Or was she simply swapping one kind of dependency for another? The wealth, the comfort, did any of it really matter when it was bought with her body? Despite the questions swirling in her head, she found herself preparing for the procedure, steeling herself for what was to come. There was no turning back now. The day of the procedure arrived, and Sarah found herself once again at the fertility clinic, lying on a cold table under bright lights. Dr. Adams and the nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, preparing her for the injections that would start the process. The hormones were meant to stimulate her ovaries, making her body produce multiple eggs for fertilization. The needles were sharp, and Sarah winced as they pricked her skin. She had endured far worse, but there was something about this that made it all the more invasive. Victor was not with her today. She hadn't expected him to be. He had arranged everything, of course, but he had remained distant, delegating the task to his lawyers and the doctors. He was present in the way a businessman was present during a merger, interested in the result, but never concerned with the messiness of the process. As she lay there, trying to steady her breathing, a strange thought crept into Sarah's mind. Was this what he wanted? She had agreed to his proposition for financial stability, but what about the child? Did he care at all about the life he was bringing into the world? Or was it merely a means to an end? A trophy to display, a legacy to leave behind? All right, Sarah, Dr. Adams's voice broke through her thoughts. We'll start the first round of hormones now. It will take a few days for your body to adjust, but everything should go smoothly. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to push all the doubts aside. There was no room for hesitation now. After the procedure, Sarah returned to the mansion, her body aching from the injections. She went to her room and collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Victor. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. She nodded, sitting up on the edge of the bed. Victor entered, his expression as unreadable as always, though there was something more than business in his eyes tonight. Something that hinted at concern? "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "Just tired." Victor sat on the edge of the bed, a few inches away from her. The silence between them stretched, but this time it felt different. There was a weight to it, a shared understanding that neither of them had fully expressed. "I know this is difficult for you," Victor said quietly, his gaze lingering on her face. "I'm not trying to make this harder than it already is." Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't want his pity. She didn't need his sympathy. But his words stirred something inside her, a flicker of something she didn't fully understand. "I'm doing this for me," she said, her voice firmer now. "Not because of you." Victor's lips quirked into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand," he said softly, "but know this, I will keep my end of the bargain. You'll have everything you need. You'll never want for anything again." Sarah met his gaze, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had made her choice, but what kind of future had she really signed up for? The weeks that followed were a blur of doctor visits, hormone injections, and moments of quiet contemplation. Sarah's body was slowly transforming, her stomach beginning to show the signs of the intense treatments, though the process felt more like a blur than a series of steps toward motherhood. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, her thoughts swirling between the life she had left behind and the future that seemed both uncertain and out of reach. Victor remained ever distant, his presence in the mansion fleeting, as he spent long hours at work, handling the affairs of his business empire. Despite his financial promises, his interest in her well-being seemed minimal. She had come to expect little from him, and he continued to treat the arrangement as a mere transaction. Every now and then, he would check in with her, his visits punctuated by polite inquiries about how she was feeling, but he never stayed long enough to allow for any meaningful conversation. In some ways, Sarah preferred it that way. She had no interest in becoming emotionally entangled with Victor. His wealth, his coldness, his promises, none of it mattered. She had made this choice for herself, and though she questioned it often, the truth was that she had little choice in the matter. This was her only option, the only way out of the life she had known. And yet, there were moments when the cold walls of the mansion felt too large, too isolating. There were times when she would catch herself gazing out the large windows, wondering if she was doing the right thing. Was she just another commodity in a world of wealth and power? Was she simply a tool in Victor's mission to create the perfect heir? One evening, as Sarah sat in the parlor, reading a book she had found in the mansion's library, she felt the familiar weight of Victor's presence before she saw him. He entered the room quietly, his footsteps muted against the marble floors, and for a brief moment, he didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, as if measuring her. Sarah looked up from the pages, her book resting in her lap. "You're looking better," Victor said, his tone softer than usual. "Thanks," she replied, closing the book and setting it aside. There was an awkward silence between them, and for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Sarah felt a strange pull, something between them, though she couldn't quite put a name to it. Was it sympathy? Guilt? Or was it something else entirely? "I've been meaning to ask," Victor said, breaking the silence. "How do you feel about all this? The process? The pregnancy?" Sarah swallowed, unsure of how to answer. The question was unexpected, but perhaps it was something she had needed to hear. She studied him for a moment, wondering if he truly cared, or if this was just another part of the game. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft. "It's all a lot. I thought I knew what I was getting into, but it's harder than I thought." Victor's eyes softened, just slightly, as if her vulnerability had caught him off guard. He took a step closer, and for the first time, she noticed the smallest crack in his usually controlled exterior. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly, his voice less sure than before. "I know I'm not much help, but if you need something, I can be here." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. Sarah had not expected compassion from him. She had long since written him off as another powerful man who saw her as nothing more than a tool in his carefully curated life. But now, something in his demeanor had shifted. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about the two of them, about their shared situation, their connection, however tenuous it might be. "I didn't ask for any of this," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here now, and I guess I'll see it through." Victor nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a long moment, as if trying to read her, to understand her better. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed, and the wall between them seemed to rise once more. "I'll leave you to rest," he said, turning to leave. "But remember, if you need anything, you can ask." As he walked away, Sarah sat in the quiet room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It was strange. She didn't know what to make of his offer. Could she rely on him? Could she trust him to be more than the distant, calculating man he had shown himself to be? Or was this simply another fleeting moment of kindness that would vanish when it was no longer convenient for him? For the first time, Sarah wasn't sure. In the weeks that followed, the bond between Sarah and Victor remained fragile, built on fleeting moments and tentative gestures. Victor had kept his promise to check in with her regularly, but still, there was no real connection between them. No real friendship, no growing affection. He was always polite, always distant, and she remained resolutely uninterested in him as anything other than the man who had offered her this life. The pregnancy progressed, and though Sarah felt the life growing inside her, she also felt the increasing pressure of her situation. She had grown accustomed to the quiet isolation of the mansion, the luxury, and the solitude, but it was starting to feel like a gilded cage. Every time she went to the fertility clinic for her checkups, there were reminders of the cold, clinical nature of the arrangement. The doctors and nurses treated her with respect, but there was always the sense that she was a patient, not a person. The hormones made her moods fluctuate. The constant medical procedures felt invasive, and the knowledge that her body was being used as a vessel for Victor's legacy left her feeling like she was losing herself in the process. But there was no turning back. One morning, after another round of tests, Dr. Adams informed Sarah that the embryo transfer was successful. She was pregnant. The words landed in her chest like a heavy weight, and for a moment, she felt a strange sense of emptiness. She was going to have Victor's child. The news hit her harder than she expected. The realization settled deep within her. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement anymore. It was real. And despite everything she had told herself, part of her couldn't help but wonder what this child would mean for her future, for her relationship with Victor. But that question, like so many others, would have to wait. The next chapter of her life was already unfolding, and there was no escaping it. As the weeks passed, the reality of Sarah's pregnancy began to settle into her bones. The physical changes were undeniable, her belly rounding gently, the constant fatigue, the nausea that came in waves. She had never imagined that being pregnant would feel this way, so vulnerable, so intense. Every day felt like an emotional roller coaster, and with the hormones flooding her body, there were moments of overwhelming sadness followed by fleeting bursts of joy. Victor remained largely a stranger in her life, his occasional visits more professional than personal. He still treated the pregnancy as part of the agreement, just another task to be completed, another step toward the child he desired. But there were moments, subtle and fleeting, when something in his demeanor shifted. He would look at her, and there would be something in his eyes that Sarah couldn't quite place. Concern? Guilt? Or perhaps something more. Something buried beneath the cold exterior he carefully maintained. One night, as Sarah sat in the spacious kitchen of the mansion, a hot cup of tea in hand, she heard the familiar sound of Victor's footsteps approaching. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she stared out the window at the city lights stretching below, the hum of Manhattan drifting up to the penthouse. The city, so alive and full of possibility, felt like a world apart from her own. "You're still awake?" Victor's voice broke the silence, calm and steady as always. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, offering a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," she replied simply. "I'm just trying to make sense of all this." Victor took a seat across from her at the polished marble table, his posture straight and controlled. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them. Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the way he watched her with an intensity that made her uneasy, but also strangely comforting. "Are you adjusting?" Victor asked after a pause, his voice softer than usual. The question caught her off guard. It was a small moment of genuine curiosity, not one of business or necessity. She set the cup down, folding her hands in front of her. "I'm not sure what there is to adjust to," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet bitterness. "Everything's been set for me. My life, my future. Everything's been planned out. I'm just following the steps." Victor studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, not just as the woman carrying his child, but as a person. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said, the words coming out slowly, as though he had carefully considered them. "When I made the offer, I thought it would be simpler. But it's not just a transaction. I didn't expect it to be difficult for you. Or for me." Sarah blinked, startled by his honesty. This wasn't the cold, calculated man she had grown accustomed to. This was something else. She wasn't sure if she should trust it, but there was something in his tone that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice quieter, more vulnerable than she intended. Victor hesitated, looking down at his hands before lifting his gaze to meet hers. Because I'm starting to realize that it's not just about the child anymore. It's about what we're both going through. He paused, letting the words sink in. I can't pretend like I don't care about how this affects you. The sincerity in his voice took Sarah off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The wall she had carefully built around herself, the barriers she had erected to protect her heart, suddenly felt fragile. Why does it matter now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't your plan. You just wanted a child, and I was the means to an end. Victor's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice low but firm. It was never just about that. I thought it was, but it's not. I didn't expect this. He gestured between them, as though the words alone couldn't express what he meant. I didn't expect you to become more than just a part of the arrangement. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. For the first time, Sarah saw the cracks in Victor's facade, the vulnerability he had hidden so well. Victor, she began, but her voice faltered. She didn't know what she was trying to say. She didn't know how to make sense of what was happening between them. Was this some form of guilt on his part? Or was it something else? Before she could finish, Victor's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and immediately stood up, straightening his jacket as he looked down at her. I have to go, he said, his voice returning to its usual detached tone. But let's talk more soon. Sarah nodded, though the words felt hollow. As he turned and walked toward the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something fragile and undefined. The days that followed felt different. Victor became more present, checking in with Sarah more often than before. His visits to the mansion were no longer brief and impersonal. He lingered a little longer, talking to her about trivial things. His work, the weather, even the food she was eating. The distance that had once defined their relationship began to lessen, but only slightly. Victor's behavior was inconsistent, sometimes warm and thoughtful, other times distant and cold. But for Sarah, it was enough to make her question everything she had believed about him and about herself. Could she be falling for a man she had once seen as nothing more than a distant benefactor? Could this arrangement, born of necessity, become something more? Her heart wavered, unsure whether to trust the feelings that were starting to take root. She had always guarded herself, but now, with Victor's presence in her life, the wall she had built around her seemed to crumble a little more each day. The pregnancy continued to progress smoothly, and as the days passed, Sarah found herself growing attached to the life inside her. It wasn't just a part of the arrangement anymore. It was real. It was hers. And despite the uncertainty and the doubts that clouded her mind, she knew that she would do anything to protect this child, no matter what it meant for her future. But as much as she tried to push the thoughts aside, the question still lingered. What would happen when this was all over? Would she still have a place in Victor's life? Or would she return to the streets, discarded once the child had been born? Would she ever be more than just a surrogate to him? Those answers were still a long way off. And for now, all Sarah could do was hold on to the present, one fragile moment at a time. As Sarah's pregnancy advanced, so did the quiet transformation within her. She found herself more and more absorbed in the growing life inside her. Each small movement, each flutter, was a reminder of something real, something beyond the sterile walls of the mansion, beyond the cold, distant arrangement she had agreed to. Her body, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a home. This child, despite how it had come to be, was hers. Victor's presence in her life had become a confusing mix of kindness and indifference. He still maintained his distance emotionally, yet there was no denying the subtle shifts in his behavior. He began to check in on her more frequently, asking how she was feeling, ensuring that she was comfortable. There were moments when his eyes softened as he observed her, and although he would quickly turn away, the lingering warmth was enough to make Sarah question her own feelings. She had never imagined that she could feel anything more than resentment toward him. She had come into this arrangement with clear intentions, nothing more than survival and the promise of a better life. But as time passed, his unexpected gestures of care, no matter how fleeting, began to chip away at the walls she had carefully constructed around herself. One evening, After a particularly long day of appointments at the fertility clinic, Sarah sat alone on the balcony of the mansion, watching the sunset behind the Manhattan skyline. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the city lights flickering below like a sea of stars. She had grown used to the silence, to the emptiness of the mansion that had once felt like an insurmountable fortress. But now, as she sat there, she could feel the weight of the decision she had made pressing down on her. The life inside her was more than a contract. It was a promise, a future that was slowly but surely unfolding before her eyes. "Are you okay?" The sound of Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. She hadn't heard him approach, but she wasn't surprised. He had a way of moving through the mansion without making a sound. She turned to look at him, trying to read the expression on his face. There was no business in his tone, no cold calculation. His eyes were soft, almost hesitant. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Just thinking." Victor stepped closer, his gaze following hers as he looked out at the skyline. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were sharing a silent understanding, one that neither of them fully comprehended yet. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a while, his voice low and thoughtful. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Sarah didn't know how to respond. The truth was, it hadn't been easy for her. But she had learned to live with the uncertainty, to navigate the strange dynamic between them. Still, there was something in his voice, something in his expression, that made her wonder if he truly understood. "I'm just trying to figure things out," she replied, her words more honest than she had intended. Victor nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't want to complicate things for you," he said, his voice sincere, "but I can't pretend that I don't care. I've been distant, I know, but it's not because I don't want to be here." Sarah studied him, trying to discern the truth in his words. She had always seen him as the distant, calculated man, the one who had offered her an agreement and then retreated into his world of power and privilege. But now, there was something different about him. His vulnerability, though brief, was undeniable. "You don't have to explain," she said softly, turning her gaze back to the skyline. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm here now, and so are you." For a long time, there was silence between them, comfortable and yet full of unspoken emotions. Sarah could feel the tension building, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. She wasn't sure what to make of it. She wasn't sure if she was ready to acknowledge it. But as Victor stepped closer to her, the faintest trace of warmth in his eyes, Sarah couldn't help but feel something shift inside her. She had never imagined that the man who had once seemed like a stranger to her could be the one who would understand her in ways she hadn't expected. "Sarah," Victor said, his voice soft but firm, "I want to make sure you know, this isn't just about the child anymore. It's about you. About us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah felt her heart race, her thoughts tumbling over one another. Was this real? Was it just another moment of weakness on his part? Or was it something more? Before she could respond, there was a sound from the hallway, an abrupt interruption. The door to the balcony opened, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry to interrupt," came the voice of Victor's assistant. Sarah had never paid much attention to her name, but she was a familiar figure who often appeared at the worst times. "There's a call for you, Mr. Woodward." Victor glanced at Sarah, his eyes filled with regret before turning to leave the balcony. As he walked away, the moment between them dissolved, leaving Sarah standing alone once more. But as she stood there, a strange feeling of warmth lingered inside her. It wasn't just the child growing inside her that had begun to change her. It was Victor, too. Despite his distance, despite the walls he had built around himself, there was something real between them, something that couldn't be ignored. As the door closed behind him, Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers resting lightly on her stomach. The future seemed less certain than ever before, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. In the days that followed, Victor became more attentive, his visits more frequent, his gestures more thoughtful. He would bring her books, talk to her about his day, ask her how she was feeling, even though the conversations often felt awkward and unsure. But the distance between them had begun to close, and with every passing day, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the connection between them was shifting, becoming something she couldn't easily define. Her body was changing, and so was the dynamic between them. There was no denying that Sarah was beginning to see Victor in a different light. What had begun as an arrangement, a business transaction, had started to evolve into something more complicated. And though she wasn't sure where it would lead, one thing was clear. Neither of them could go back to the way things were before. As the pregnancy advanced, Sarah found herself asking the same question over and over again. What would happen when this was all over? Would she return to the streets, discarded once the child was born? Or would there be something more between her and Victor than the cold, calculated agreement they had made? For now, she didn't have the answers. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she needed them. The future felt uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, she could face it with Victor by her side. The days blurred together as Sarah's due date approached. Each morning, she woke up with the familiar weight of her pregnancy pressing down on her. Yet there was a strange anticipation in the air. It wasn't just the excitement of the child growing inside her. It was the tension between her and Victor that seemed to be escalating with each passing day. They had reached a point where words no longer seemed enough to express what was happening between them. A fragile connection, built on moments of unspoken understanding, was beginning to bloom in the silence. Victor, once so distant and cold, had become a constant presence in her life. He seemed to be trying in ways she hadn't expected. He would help her up when she struggled to stand, a soft touch of his hand at her back as she navigated the mansion's marble floors. He began to attend doctor appointments with her, his usually impeccable suit contrasting against the sterile, clinical setting. At first, it had felt awkward, like he was playing a role he wasn't comfortable with. But over time, those awkward moments had turned into genuine efforts that made Sarah question everything she had believed about him, about this entire arrangement. The night it all came to a head was a stormy one. Sarah had been feeling off all day, her body restless as if the baby inside her was eager to make an appearance. The contractions had started, light at first, but steadily growing in intensity. She had dismissed them at first, thinking they were just another part of the pregnancy. But as the evening wore on, it became clear. This was the real thing. Victor had been at his office all day, and Sarah hadn't wanted to bother him. She had convinced herself that she could handle it on her own. But as the pain became unbearable, she found herself pacing the penthouse, clutching the edge of the couch, trying to steady her breathing. The sound of the elevator doors opening caught her attention. She froze for a moment, her hand on her stomach, as she felt another contraction rip through her. This one was stronger than the others. "Sarah?" Victor's voice echoed through the hallway as he entered, his footsteps quickening when he saw her standing there, her face contorted in pain. "What's happening? Are you okay?" She gasped, the words getting caught in her throat as another wave of pain hit her. "I think it's time." Victor's eyes widened, his calm demeanor replaced with a rush of panic. Okay, he said, his voice suddenly frantic. "We need to get you to the hospital. Now." But as he stepped toward her, Sarah shook her head, trying to steady herself. "I can't. I don't think I can wait that long," she said, her voice shaky. "It's happening too fast." Victor didn't hesitate. He reached out, his hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her into his arms, guiding her toward the door. She didn't argue. In that moment, there was only him. His presence was steadying, even though she could feel the anxiety rolling off him in waves. The car ride to the hospital was a blur. Sarah's mind was clouded with the pain, her focus on the tightening contractions that seemed to come faster with each passing second. She could hear Victor's voice in the background, his words of reassurance, but they felt distant, like they were coming from underwater. When they finally arrived at the hospital, the staff rushed her inside, and Victor followed closely behind, his eyes never leaving her. Sarah was whisked into a room, the sterile white walls stark against the tumultuous emotions swirling inside her. She barely registered the doctor and nurses preparing for the delivery. All she could focus on was the overwhelming feeling of helplessness, the powerlessness that came with being so vulnerable in a moment like this. Victor was there, though, right beside her. He held her hand as she gripped the bed rail, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She could feel him beside her, his presence solid and unwavering, as if he were trying to anchor her to reality. For the first time in their strange, tumultuous relationship, there was no pretense between them. No deal, no contract, just two people. One, a man who had once seen her as little more than a means to an end, and the other, a woman who had never expected to feel anything but resentment toward him. When the doctor announced that she was fully dilated, Sarah's heart raced. The moment was imminent. It was real. The child she had carried for months would soon be born. And despite all the uncertainty, despite the confusion, she realized she was ready. "I'm here," Victor whispered, his voice hoarse. He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing the back of her palm. "You're not alone." The words were simple, but they were everything. In that moment, Sarah's breath hitched. She could feel the tension between them dissipating, replaced by something far deeper. It wasn't just the physical pain she was enduring. It was the raw, vulnerable truth of what had come to pass. She had started this journey alone, unsure of what the future would hold, but somehow now she wasn't alone. And as the first cries of their children filled the room, she felt the bond between them solidify in a way she couldn't explain. The doctor's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "You're having triplets." The shock of the words hit Sarah like a wave. Triplets. She had always thought she was carrying one child, but now, 3 lives, 3 tiny beings, would soon be in her arms. The realization sent a flood of emotion through her. She had never known love like this, not even for the child she was expecting. Victor, too, was in shock. His face paled for a moment, and Sarah could see the flicker of disbelief in his eyes. But then, as the babies were placed into her arms, all of that faded. For the first time, she saw Victor as a man who had been changed by the very thing he had tried to control. His eyes softened, his voice cracking as he spoke for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. "They're beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're ours." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at the tiny, fragile faces of her newborns. Her heart swelled in ways she had never imagined. These were her children, more than just a contract, more than just a transaction. They were real, and they were hers. And now, in this moment, they were Victor's too. As she looked at him, the man who had once seemed so distant, so cold, she saw something different in him now, something that could never be undone. He wasn't just the man who had paid for a child. He was a father. And she wasn't just a surrogate. They had created something together, something that could never be measured in dollars or contracts. In that moment, as they both looked down at their children, something inside Sarah shifted. She no longer felt like a stranger in her own life. She wasn't just a woman caught in an arrangement. She was a mother. And perhaps for the first time, she saw the possibility of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for Sarah, that was enough. Victor stood beside the hospital bed, his eyes transfixed on the 3 tiny faces that had just entered the world. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't know what to feel. The cold, calculated man he had been, the one who saw everything as a business deal, as a series of transactions, was slipping away. In its place stood someone unfamiliar, someone who had been irrevocably changed by what had just happened. The babies, fragile and small, were swaddled in soft blankets, their little faces contorted as they adjusted to the world outside the womb. Sarah, her face pale but glowing with a quiet strength, cradled them gently. Her tears, though silent, spoke louder than anything Victor had ever heard. She was a mother now, not just to one child, but to 3. Victor had thought he understood what fatherhood was. He had always seen it as something that could be bought, something that could be earned. But as he stood there, watching Sarah with their children, he realized he was wrong. He had underestimated the depth of this experience. Fatherhood wasn't something that could be purchased or manipulated. It was earned through love, through sacrifice, through moments like this, raw, vulnerable, and absolutely real. His gaze lingered on the smallest of the triplets, a girl with dark, curly hair and eyes that fluttered open, taking in the world around her. She looked up at him, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb. Victor felt a jolt in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. This was his child, his daughter. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes still locked on the baby in his arms. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming flood of emotions that now consumed him. Sarah, her voice soft and full of love, met his eyes. "You don't need to say anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the overwhelming experience. "You're here. That's enough." Victor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle deep within him. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to maintain distance, to never let emotions cloud his judgment. But now, as he stood here, holding his child for the first time, he realized that control meant nothing in this moment. It was a facade, a mask he had worn to protect himself from the vulnerability of connection. But now, there was no mask. There was only the raw, undeniable truth. He was a father. These children, his children, were real, and they needed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been so distant. I didn't know how to—" He cut himself off, his throat tightening. Sarah smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to apologize," she said, her fingers gently brushing the baby's tiny hand. "We're both figuring this out, but I'm glad you're here." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with a sense of understanding between them that had been years in the making. For the first time, they were both seeing each other clearly, not through the lens of a contract, not through the cold filter of business, but as two people bound by something real. Victor glanced at the other two babies, one boy and another girl, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't name. They were all his. He would never have imagined it, never thought it possible, that something as pure as this could grow from the arrangement he had so coldly set in motion. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I don't know what comes next," he said, his voice steady now, though still touched by the emotion he couldn't suppress. "But I want to be here. For all of you." Sarah's eyes softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You already are," she said quietly, her voice full of quiet strength. "And that's all that matters." In the days that followed, Victor found himself spending more and more time at the hospital. Every spare moment he had, he spent by Sarah's side, helping her care for the babies, learning the basics of fatherhood he had once dismissed. It was overwhelming. The late-night feedings, the constant cries, the endless demands that seemed to come from three tiny lives who depended on him entirely. But through it all, something within him shifted. His world had once revolved around business deals, investments, and contracts. His days were filled with meetings, calls, and the cold, methodical pursuit of success. But now, as he sat by Sarah's side in the quiet moments of the night, holding their children in his arms, he realized that none of that mattered anymore. Victor didn't know if he was ready to be the kind of father Sarah had always wanted, but he was determined to try. Every time one of the babies looked up at him, their tiny eyes full of trust, he felt his heart swell in a way he had never experienced before. "I never thought it would feel like this," he confessed to Sarah one evening, as they watched the babies sleep in their crib. "I never thought I could care this much." Sarah turned to him, her face soft in the dim light. "Neither did I," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But we're in this together. We'll figure it out." For the first time in years, Victor found himself believing in something beyond himself, something bigger than money, bigger than success. It was the sense of responsibility he had never fully understood, the bond that formed between a parent and child, the feeling of being needed in a way that no contract or business deal could ever match. He looked at Sarah, who was now more than just a woman who had borne his children. She was his partner, in every sense of the word. She was the one who had shown him what real love looked like, what real family meant, and he was determined to prove to her, and to himself, that he could be the father his children needed. As he held his daughter that night, the weight of the world seemed to settle around him. But it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. And for the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't in the wealth he had amassed. It wasn't in the deals he had closed. It was in the children who now depended on him, the children he loved with all of his heart. And, for the first time, he was ready to embrace the life he had never known he wanted. The transformation was slow, but it was real. As Victor and Sarah adjusted to their new life, they faced challenges. No new parent was immune to them. But with each challenge, they grew closer. And with each day, Victor found himself more and more certain that the path they had taken, no matter how unconventional, was the one that had led him to the truest form of love he had ever known. And so, as the weeks passed, Victor stood beside Sarah, watching as their children grew. The bond between them strengthened, not just for the sake of the children, but because they had come to understand that what they had built was more than just a family. It was a partnership. A partnership forged through the most unexpected of circumstances, but one that, in the end, would be the most important thing either of them had ever known. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life in the mansion had changed beyond recognition. No longer was it a place of sterile silence, where wealth and business deals were the currency of existence. Now, it echoed with the sounds of children, laughter, crying, the pitter-patter of tiny feet, and the warmth of a family that had once seemed impossible. Victor had changed in ways he never thought possible. He still worked, of course. Old habits die hard. But he had found himself setting aside more and more of his time to be with Sarah and the children. There was a new softness in his eyes, a tenderness that had not existed before. His world, once confined to spreadsheets, contracts, and boardrooms, had expanded into something he hadn't prepared for. It was a world filled with unexpected joy, the chaotic beauty of parenthood, the mess and the laughter, the sleepless nights and the overwhelming love. And it was a world that, despite all of its imperfections, felt like home. Victor sat in the nursery one evening, holding his daughter, the one who had opened his eyes to the depth of love. His hands, once cold and indifferent, now cradled her gently as she gazed up at him, her tiny fingers gripping his thumb. Her eyes, bright and full of wonder, looked back at him with trust and something else, something he had never expected to find in himself. She was his, as were her siblings, and no amount of money or business success could change that. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the family. Victor had insisted on staying home tonight, something he had once never done. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. He hadn't realized how much he had missed being present, how much he had taken for granted the time that had slipped by while he had been consumed by the pursuit of wealth. When Sarah entered the room, she smiled at the sight of him, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to reflect the transformation they had both undergone. She could see it in his eyes. The man who had once been so distant, so guarded, was now fully here, fully present. For her, for their children. "She's growing so fast," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with awe. "I can hardly believe it." Victor looked up at her, his heart swelling. "I know," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I never thought this would be my life. I thought I had it all figured out, but this is more than I could have ever imagined." Sarah walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and familiar. "We both thought we knew what we wanted. But sometimes, life has other plans for us. Plans that are better than anything we could have dreamed up on our own." Victor nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was a depth to their connection now, something that couldn't be expressed in words. It was in the way they looked at each other, in the way they shared these quiet moments together, as parents, as partners, as equals. The contract that had once defined their relationship felt like a distant memory. It had served its purpose. It had brought them together, yes, but it was no longer the foundation of their bond. Their bond was something far deeper. It was built on shared experiences, sacrifices, and the love they had discovered for one another and for their children. "I'm glad I found you," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could feel this way, but I do. I'm sorry for everything I did before. I should have seen it sooner." Sarah leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek in a soft, reassuring kiss. "You don't have to apologize. We've both learned, and that's what matters." For the first time, Victor truly understood what Sarah had meant when she had told him that they were in this together. It wasn't just about the children. It was about them, as a couple, navigating the messiness of life together. It was about the love that had blossomed between them in the most unlikely of circumstances. And as he looked at their children, his heart filled with a fierce protectiveness. He would do anything to give them the world. The next few years passed in a blur of joy and challenges. Parenthood was a constant lesson in patience, in sacrifice, in love. But through it all, Sarah and Victor grew closer. Their relationship deepened, no longer defined by a contract, but by the shared life they had built together. Victor found himself learning new things about himself every day. He learned how to be present, how to listen, how to put someone else's needs above his own. He had always believed that success was measured by money and power, but now he understood that true success was measured by the love and trust of those closest to you. Sarah, too, had changed. The woman who had once been a stranger to him, someone who had only existed within the confines of their agreement, was now his partner in every sense of the word. She had shown him that love wasn't something that could be bought, that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who you chose to stand beside you through thick and thin. And in her, he had found someone who stood beside him, no matter what. One day, as they sat together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard, Sarah turned to Victor, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You know," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I think we've both come a long way." Victor smiled, his heart full. "I think you're right." They sat in companionable silence, the sound of their children's laughter filling the air, a sound that felt like a melody, a song of family, of love, and of the life they had built together. In that moment, Victor realized that he had finally found something that mattered more than anything he had ever pursued. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't success. It was love in its truest form, with all its complexities and imperfections. And that love, he knew, would carry them through whatever life had in store. The contract that had once bound them together had long since been forgotten. What remained was something far stronger, something that could never be measured in money or legal terms. It was a bond forged through the raw, transformative power of love. And as they watched their children grow, Victor and Sarah knew that the story they had started, one of unlikely beginnings and unexpected love, was only just beginning. Thank you so much for following and listening to our story from start to finish. I hope you found touching moments and meaningful lessons in each twist and turn of this journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video so we can continue exploring many more exciting stories together. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think about the story. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss any future videos. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next story.